This is Understanding U.S. Government. I'm your host, Mr. Giese. In this episode, we'll be looking at the principles of government. We will be discussing what the elements of a state are, the different theories of how a state came to be, and then outline the characteristics of our government. So let's get started. Each state, whether good or bad, will have some sort of government. Now, when I say state, please don't confuse this with that of the state of the United States. A state is a nation or territory considered as an organized political community under one government. By looking at this definition, we can see that there are four elements of a state. But let's break that down. The first of the four elements would be that of a border. The state needs to have a defined land. The second would be people. Each state needs to have some sort of population. The next would be a government, or the state needs to be politically organized. We'll get into this in a little more detail in just a moment. And the final element would be sovereignty. This means that this state has supreme and absolute power within its territory. Essentially, no other country has control over this nation. Now, how does a state come to be? There are four theories behind this, and we'll touch on each briefly. So the first is the force theory. Just like in the name, a group of people claim power over another group of people by force. The second is divine right theory. This was often in the case in areas with a monarch. These monarchs often ruled by divine right, or that their creator had given those of royal birth the power to rule. The subject of this theory, or this land, had to follow their leaders as they would follow their creator. The third is the evolutionary theory. This is the idea that a population developed from primitive families. And in these families, the elders were the ones in control and dictated where the population would go. And that brings us to our final theory, and a theory that you'll hear quite a bit about, the social contract theory. This followed the Enlightenment thinkers that believed the state arose out of a voluntary act of free people. Essentially, you could look at this as a contract between the government and its citizens. The belief goes further with the idea that the power comes from the people. Therefore, like any contract, if the people decide that the government is not acting in the best interest of the people, then the people have the ability to withhold that power from the government. Now, once the state is established, the political organization or government must help solidify this state. Think of the government as the glue that keeps all of the other pieces of the state together. So state must be able to do certain things, and they do this through a government. A government must have an institution that makes law. For the United States, that would be our Congress. This is a power known as the legislative power. A government must also be able to execute these laws once they come into power, and this is known as the executive power. We often look at this as the office of the president and all of the agencies underneath them. And finally, a government must be able to decide or judge if those laws that are being made and executed in its judicial powers. Again, in the United States, the judicial power is led by the Supreme Court. Now, the United States separates these three powers into three branches, but not all governments do this. However, whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy like the United States, all three of these powers are exercised by the government in power. The government can be outlined in a formal constitution, and this helps the government stay in check. If the rules are established in a constitution, then the government will have a guideline of how to regulate their actions or exercise their powers.